Welcome to Off Hours, a conversation between John Edwards and Chris Manning.
So you've been doing some movement shopping.
I have been. For a little bit of background, over the last few years, I've been wanting to make my own watches. While I would like to make my own movements from scratch, I'm also, realistic about the amount of time that I have right now and the amount of effort that's involved in making a movement from scratch. So in the meantime, I've been looking at making my own line of watches using pre-purchased movements. And I've been sort of on the hunt for a watch movement that I can buy for quite a few years now.
And how have things been going?
Well, not too bad. I think my early movements that I was looking at were from PTS out of Hong Kong. They certainly had a good selection of movements. I've never gotten around to ordering any, so I'm not sure what the quality was like. And one of the reasons why I started looking around at other places to buy movements outside of the obvious one, which is Switzerland, was because ETA had decided, I guess what's that, about 10 years ago now, they decided they wanted to cut back on selling watch movements to the rest of the industry, and they wanted to keep them internal to the Swatch Group. And so while I would have been happy buying ETA movements for my watches just like everyone else, I also realized that was coming to an end. I've been trying to look around for other companies to buy movements from. I guess just recently you and I had been talking about various movements that were available, and we got to talking about Eterna.
Yeah, to flesh a bit of the backgrounds out for those who might not be familiar, going right down to fundamentals, ETA makes what are essentially the engines of a watch. And up until just a few years ago, if you wanted to buy a reliable Swiss-made mechanical watch movement to power a watch you'd designed, ETA was the go-to supplier for that in Switzerland. They had a near monopoly on the market and still do to some extent, even in spite of the cutbacks. Name a Swiss watch brand, there's a good chance that they've used ETA movements at some point in their history, at some point in their collection. I mean, Omega, Cartier, Breitling, IWC, Tag Heuer, Tudor, which is owned by Rolex, and even industry stalwarts like Patek Philippe had components of their timepieces made by ETA and its offshoots like Niverox. And as you mentioned, over the course of the last decade or so, ETA has begun cutting back supply to focus on production for brands under its parent organization, which is the Swatch Group, which owns brands spanning the gamut from Swatch up to Breguet. And what I also find interesting about this turn of events, or Eterna's recent ascent as a supplier of mechanical watch movements in the void that's been left, is the fact that ETA was spun off from Eterna in the 1930s, ETA being a concatenation of Eterna. I guess the irony, if you look at it that way, is that Eterna now is no longer even a Swiss-owned company. It's still a Swiss company, but the conglomerate that has come to own Eterna in recent years is actually Chinese. The year before, ETA helped usher in the Swatch watch back in 1983, which played a pivotal role in Swiss watch brands' rebound from the quartz crisis. Eterna was sold, and it's changed hands a number of times over the ensuing decades, including a short period where it was owned by Porsche Design in the late 90s, until they were ultimately acquired by China Haidon Holdings in 2012. They've rebranded themselves for understandable reasons in terms of trying to maintain the prestige of a Swiss watch manufacturer. China Haidon is now known as City Champ Watch and Jewelry Group. Yeah, a lot of micro brands who aren't using movements that are coming out of Asia or from other small suppliers that have stepped in to fill the ETA void, like Solida or Soprod is another, used by micro brands like Oak and Oscar. A lot of micro brands are turning to Eterna for a good reason. They offer quite a variety of movements at a reasonable price point, and they are still produced in Switzerland at prices that are very comparable to what you would have been able to buy ETA movements for.
One of the advantages that I found through dealing with Eterna is that they're willing to talk to someone like me who is only interested in purchasing watches at a small scale or watch movements at a small scale. I'm not interested in buying 200 movements or 500 movements or 10,000 movements. A lot of companies were just unwilling to talk to me because I am not big enough to deal with. For somebody like myself, where I'm interested in selling maybe a few tens of watches a year, trying to buy 100 movements at a time, unless I'm willing to use the exact same movement in all of my watches for the next 5 or 6 years, it's not necessarily practical for me to buy 100 units at a time.
Just out of curiosity, when had you touched base with them? Because I've gotten quotes from them for much smaller volumes than 100 pieces.
That's maybe something that's changed. I think the last time I spoke with them was maybe 4 years ago. If you're interested in purchasing a tourbillon movement from them, they're willing to sell a single tourbillon at a time. Now that's not as bad as it is with somebody like an Eterna or an Etta, because even the more complex movements, mechanical movements from a PTS is, you're talking about maybe at most $30 or $50 American a unit. Whereas with Eterna and Etta and companies like that, each movement is in the hundreds of dollars. It's a little bit more practical to buy 100 units from PTS just because the costs per unit is so low. You can spend $4,000 or $5,000 and have 100 movements, where from the Swiss brands you're not getting 100 movements for $4,000 or $5,000. That it's sort of an order of magnitude more expensive than that.
And I would say there's an order of magnitude difference in terms of the precision of timekeeping you're going to get between the two as well.
There probably is. You're right, and so one of the things that had kept me from buying from somebody like PTS was that even though I could get these movements and I could do, I could use them in my watches, I knew that I was going to have to do quite a bit of work on them to be happy with the sort of the results, the timekeeping results that I wanted out of them. And, so the question then became, did I want to buy something like that where I was putting a bunch of work into sort of rebuilding the watch so that it was going to be more accurate, or spend more money and try and find something that I could, that I didn't have to put as much work into to do that work. So I was quite happy to find out that Eterna was willing to sell, sort of sell movements at in small quantities for me, because, as you say, the quality of timekeeping difference is significant. One of the things that I like about Eterna is that their relatively recent movement, the caliber 39, they have intentionally made a movement that is very modular, and they have added a number of functions to it. So you can basically decide what combination of functions you want, or what combination of complications you want in this movement. And then you decide, what you're interested in. So it gives you some flexibility to make a watch that isn't necessarily identical to everybody else's watch. It's not like buying an Etta 2824 where they're all pretty much the same. This way you can buy, a basic caliber 39, and you can say, all right, well, I want this with, as an automatic, or I want it as a manual wind. I want it with a moon phase dial on it, or I don't. Or I want it with a 24-hour dial for doing a separate time zone. So there's a number of different complications that you can get from them, and sort of decide what it is that you're interested in a movement.
Two quick asides, just for anyone who might not be familiar. The Etta 2824 is sort of a workhorse entry-level watch movement. It was quite ubiquitous among mid-range watch brands coming out of Switzerland, and still is quite ubiquitous, and actually serves as the base caliber for a lot of innovations that are coming out of, say, Tissot or Rado. And secondly, a complication, as you may have caught on from what Chris has been talking about, is essentially just anything above and beyond pure timekeeping on a watch dial. So things like the moon phase or a date indication. From what we've been chatting about over the past couple of weeks, I believe you settled on a moon phase complication and GMT and a subdial, right?
Yeah, there were two that I was interested in. There are a few things that I wanted in a movement. The first was that I wasn't interested in having an automatic. I wanted it to be a manual wind. So it's nice because all of the options that I have here from Eterna, they're all available in either an automatic or a manual wind. So the ones that I've sort of settled on, they're all manual winds. Yeah, and as you and I have discussed, I'm not a big fan of dates on my dials. I find that they tend to be a little bit busy, or they make the dial a bit busy. So I wasn't necessarily interested in a date option, and that's something that a lot of movements have. You have to get it with a date. So the two that I ended up settling on, the 3911 is a sort of standard time, hours, minutes, seconds. And it also has a 24-hour subdial in it. And then the other one that I ended up getting had a standard time, minutes, hours, seconds, and also has a moon phase dial on it, so that I can add that moon phase on it.
Is that the 3949?
That's the 3955 is the one that I ended up getting. Now, the 3955, it happens to have a date window on it as well. And I've ordered a prototype unit that has the date, so that I can try it with and without the date to decide if I'm interested in in actually using it. So I'll make two different dials, one with a date window and one without, and I'll build them both and photograph them, and I can test both to see sort of what I like.
Yeah, I'm surprised they don't offer the moon phase with a date hand similar to what they have for the 3904. It'd be interesting to see the dial side of both of those movements, just to see if it's even possible to somehow combine the two, because then you would actually be able to deliver something that none of the other micro brands are able to deliver on.
One of the problems that I suspect you run into with this movement, and as I said, I haven't actually seen any of these in person yet, so I'm not sure sort of what some of the limitations are of them. But I suspect that certain complications sort of stack on top of each other in a way that you can't combine some of these complications together. I think that that's just a limitation of the modularity of the design. Now, it may be something that you might be able to take a sort of the standard date complication and maybe figure out a way of modifying it to do something more interesting, so that it's not just in a date window. So I'm curious to see what they offer, what sort of offered in the base unit, and then what you can sort of do with it afterwards.
Yeah, I have an idea I've been tinkering and playing with in terms of date indicators for the past few years, on and off, just coming up with little prototypes. Nothing of substance yet, but it's been fun to experiment.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I've seen a few ideas lately. Things that people have done with date indicators that are certainly more interesting than your standard number in a window kind of thing. Also, one of the advantages that I have, because I can fabricate a lot of parts myself, I have the option of sort of experimenting with that date disc, and being able to come up with different ideas for how that date disc looks and where it is. I don't have to keep it in the 3 o'clock position. I can put it somewhere else and print my own date disc, and not have to worry about relying on sort of the same date disc that everybody else is using in the same location that everyone else is using. So I am curious to see what comes out of it. I don't know, certainly for the first couple of watches that I make, I don't know that I'm too worried about modifying the movements much from what they are now. I do know that I will be spending some serious time on refinishing them. I don't think that they are finished to the level, the movements themselves, I don't think they're finished to the level that I'm happy with, based on the photographs that I've seen and based on the reviews that I've seen from other people who've sort of opened them up, and like other watchmakers who've opened them up and looked at them. They are a bit rough. Some of the machining is a bit rough on them. Some of the pockets that they've machined out, you can still see pretty heavy machining marks in there. They haven't done anything to bevel the edges of the plates or anything like that. the screws, they didn't, they haven't blued the screws at all. So, there are things like that I suspect I will be spending my time with the movement itself at first, at least, sort of refinishing it so that it's at a higher level of finish than what it's coming out of the factory in. And that'll be a big part of my focus at first.
Yeah, some of the components don't leave as much room as I'd like to see to be able to apply more finish. The balance cock, for instance, is just a flat sheet of metal as opposed to what you'd normally see for a balance cock.
Right, and one of the things that I may end up doing going forward, it depends on how particular I get with this. One of the problems with coming at this from a jewelry point of view is my OCD when it comes to finishing is maybe higher than some people's when it comes to making things like this. So depending on how particular I get with the finish on it, I may end up remaking some of the parts. So things like the balance cock. If I'm unhappy with what's there, I may end up making my own and making something that I'm happier with. I may end up reshaping the bridges and the plates a little bit to make something that's more interesting and a bit different than what's there. We'll just have to see and see what's available or what's in the movement to begin with and what I come up with, because I don't want to have a watch movement that looks the same as everybody else's, and I don't want one that's that's finished at this level. And I suspect that most people that are buying these are probably doing some finish work on them. I don't think that people are just taking these and dropping them into watches. I may be wrong, but I don't think that most people are doing that.
And for anyone who might be interested in seeing a little bit under the hood of these calibers, Aaron Burlow did a nice teardown for Hodinkee a few years ago. So we'll link to that in the show notes as well. As I mentioned, I haven't had any experience with this particular caliber yet because it's quite new. I believe they didn't start releasing it until after the China Haiden acquisition.
Yeah, I think the earliest articles I've seen of this are maybe 2013, 2014, that kind of time frame. So, and even then, I don't think most of the options were available. So for people who don't know, there are a number of complications available. So you can get it as either a manual wind or an automatic. You can have a small seconds. You can have a central seconds. You can have a date. You can have a date indicated by hand, a 24-hour indication on a subdial. You can have the 24-hour indication as a center hand. You can have a chronograph. What else is in here? Moon phase. That's it right now. And so not all of those options were available initially when that Hodinkee article was written, but they've slowly been adding complications to it. And I do know from the conversations I've had with Chris Becker at Eterna that there are some other things that they're working on adding in. So I expect we're going to see this movement grow in terms of its options and flexibility.
Yeah, it seems like a fairly solid base. Yeah, the most recent production Eterna I've worked on would be the 3030, which the company had produced to celebrate their 150th anniversary in 2006. And I found that particular caliber to almost be over-engineered in a sense, to the extent that there would be an unnecessary number of components, more points of failure, or more potential points of failure. An interesting thing about Eterna is they were one of the first, if not the first, manufacturer to use ball bearings for the oscillating weight for automatic winding. If you look at their logo, you can overlay that on the ball bearing system on the oscillating weight. All the circles of their logo correspond to the positions of the balls in the ball bearing system. So that's where their logo comes from. I just found there were an excessive number of ball bearings in the 3030. And some other mid-20th century calibers I've worked on from Eterna, you see the relationship to, say, the ETA 2892, which the manner of construction I found was not created with serviceability in mind. Very clumsy movements to try and disassemble and reassemble. Not calibers that I would say I would be a big fan of. The caliber 39 seems thought out far more holistically. It's not engineered to the level of, say, a Rolex, but it's designed more at a level where it's designed with mass production and a balance of serviceability in mind. So it's certainly much more serviceable than some of those prior movements that I mentioned.
It's obviously a modern design, and the complications they've chosen are ones that are popular currently. They've obviously given this a lot of thought in terms of where it's going to go and what they can do with it. So I'm happy to see a company doing that and making this available out of a Swiss company, because honestly the other Swiss companies that have been offering movements have not offered a lot in terms of sort of innovation, a lot in terms of flexibility, and you just don't see that out of the companies that you're buying. Somebody like me is buying these movements from. It's great that that Rolex is designing this stuff in house, but of course they're designing it for themselves, and they're never going to release that to a small watchmaker. So unless I go out and buy buy other movements and use those, I can't take advantage of that. Now, I do know that there are people out there who do reuse movements, reuse older movements. People I can think of that off the top of my head that are doing that quite effectively are the Struthers out of London, England. They're often taking old movements and refurbishing them, refinishing them, doing interesting things with the movements, and then they go off and build very nice cases for them as well. So that's the other path to go down is sort of using a vintage movement to make a small run of watches off of. But the problem that you run into there is just the difficulty in finding a large enough number of the same movement to be, to sort of make it worth your while to do that. Otherwise, you're constantly needing to redesign your cases to be able to handle different sized movements, and maybe they don't have the features that you want, or they're not the quality that you want. So that's a bit frustrating, and especially living in Canada, there isn't necessarily the accessibility of old movements like there is in Europe. I suspect that a lot of these movements are much easier to find in sort of reasonable quantities if you're in England or mainland Europe.
I'd say it's a very fair perspective.
They're doing remarkable things, and actually, I'll put a link in the show notes to a great article that was written about them a few days ago, and somebody went and visited their shop. In fact, on their website, they have a few photos of watches that they've sort of recommissioned, or movements they've recommissioned. In particular, there's an Omega here that they've gone off and restored and rebuilt some new parts for, as well as completely refinished it. It's a gorgeous looking movement. Now, I know that they're in the process of designing their own in-house movement to be able to make themselves. I don't know if they're planning on making the entire movement themselves, or if they intend to send some of it out to be worked on. But and that's the ideal. Obviously, you want to be able to have your own movement, your own design, but it's also an incredible amount of work. I know they've been working on theirs for a few years.
Another brand doing things similar to what the Struthers are doing is the Atelier de Chronométrie out of Barcelona. They're building a lot of their pieces on a vintage Omega Caliber 266.
I hope that at some point or another I can offer my own custom movement that I'm making and, sort of designed from scratch and making from scratch. But I also realize that I'm a single person making watches. So if I go that route, there's no way that I can manufacture a lot of movements like that. There's a limit to my time, and there's a limit to the number of watches that I can produce like that. So I do need an option like Eterna to be able to produce enough watches to be able to have a brand that that has something more than just a single watch every year, and also to be able to make enough money to maintain sort of the studio and keep going, because as nice as it would be to make a single watch from hand, by hand every year and sell that, I it's not practical in terms of a cost point of view to sell a watch like that and be able to, sort of be able to pay my salary every year.
Well, it's very common to start with a base caliber of some sort. I mean, Vianney Halter began with the Bazus 7001s. Nomos as well started with that caliber. Peter Speak Marin made his first tourbillon from scratch, but his series produced pieces were based on the ETA 2824. Kari Voutilainen began with Bosch's essentially, so his early minute repeaters or decimal repeaters are what he ultimately turned them into. Those were based on things like APs and Jaeger-LeCoultre. His first series produced time only piece was based on the Peugeot 260. Yeah, I mean, you look at pretty much any small independent watchmaker, and somewhere along the line, or to some extent, they got their start with a base caliber or inspired by. And of course, George Daniels made essentially everything from scratch, but his only series produced, or I shouldn't say that, his first series produced timepiece was based on the Omega 2500 that he did with Roger Smith. But it's not at all uncommon in the industry to start with a base caliber, even if all you're keeping is the gear train and the mainspring and the hairspring and the balance and the escapement, and doing all the bridges and everything from scratch.
You know, the difficult work has been done. There's been a sort of the movement has been engineered. There's a gear train there. As you said, the springs are there. And even if I decide to build new plates, new bridges and whatnot for myself that fit the cases that I'm doing, that work is far more approachable than trying to build the entire thing from scratch myself. And so there's and it also gives me the opportunity to maybe add some of my own work to it if I need to. So it gives me a lot of flexibility in terms of what I want to do. So working with Eterna has been great so far. Things don't go as fast as you want them to. Of course, it's not like going online and going to Amazon and saying, "Oh, hey, that looks good. I'm just going to order 2 of those and they're going to show up at my door in 2 days." There's a lot of back and forth in terms of talking about which models, which movements you want, which finishing you want on them, because they can supply them with different finishes already on there. Everything from a bead blast finish to various Geneva stripe combinations, different plating options, things like that. So there are various options available to you there. So there's a lot of back and forth in terms of getting that done. And then, of course, they don't necessarily have everything right then and there. Some of these things are being made in smaller quantities. So depending on which finishes you want on them, they may have to send them out to be finished or whatever. So that's been, it's been an interesting process learning how that works. I will say the frustrating thing for me is finding the other companies around that for making other parts that I don't want to make. So for instance, finding watch crystals. If I want a standard sapphire watch crystal that's a standard diameter, let's say, then I can find that quite easily. But the moment I get into doing something a bit different, let's say I want to do a rectangular watch or a tonneau shaped watch, something like that, it then becomes difficult to find somebody who's willing to supply that kind of thing in small quantities for me. So same thing with watch straps. There are a few people out there that are doing sort of high quality watch straps that I can buy in small quantities for myself. But those sort of secondary businesses that are a little bit challenging for a small brand like me to find. So that's been an interesting process trying to source those kinds of things, and the search continues for some of them. So yeah, it'll be interesting to see where it ends up, and I suspect it's going to be probably a good 12 months before I'm happy with being able to source the materials and the parts that I'm not interested in making myself before I can sort of make a couple of these and be able to start selling them.
So it'll be interesting to see what comes of this project that you've started with these Eterna movements once you actually accept delivery of the first few.
Yeah, I don't know what to expect in terms of, as I said, I've seen some photos of the movements that especially that Hodinkee article. There were some great photos of the movements in there. So I don't know what to expect. That was a few years ago. I don't know if they've improved their sort of mass finishing processes and if they're delivering something that, that maybe has slightly better surface finish from the machining. I know the few photos that I've seen, things like screws, which I expect to have a black polish on. It's not quite at what I would, what I'm willing to accept for a polish. So I know that there are things like that I'll need to refinish. And as I said, I love the look of a blued screw in my watch movement. It adds a little bit of contrast to the movement. So there's things like that I know I'll have to do, but I'm really looking forward to seeing them and being able to sort of tear them apart and see what makes them tick, so to speak, and how I can use them for what I'm doing. Because obviously, to begin with, a large part of what I'm interested in is the case design and the dial design. That's where my skill set lies right now, and so I'm already experimenting with some design ideas right now, and I've printed off a few movements so that I've got an idea of how large they are. I will say one of the nice things about working with somebody like an Eterna is that they're used to working with other companies that are manufacturing for their movements, and they're not just necessarily buying them as drop-in replacements, in terms of repairing or fixing something. They provide you with drawings and 3D models of their movements so that you can start working on the designs. You don't have to wait until an actual prototype movement arrives. So even though I've been working with them for the past month or so, I've been designing my case at the same time because I've already got the drawings and models of those movements, and I know exactly what size they are and what shape they are, and I know where the clearances are and the screw holes are and things like that. So, yeah, it's nice working with a company like this that is interested in you succeeding with their movement, because they obviously want to sell more of these, and so if you're able to succeed in designing and developing a case and dial and whatnot around their movement, then you're going to be more successful. So it's nice dealing with a company like that's interested in helping you.
Is there anything that you foresee as being a challenge that you're going to have to face once they actually arrive, or are you just unknowns at this point?
There are a few interesting challenges that I'm not familiar with, and this is where my inexperience with watches comes in. If you sit down and say to me, "Okay, I've got a design idea for a pen," I can quickly develop a pen design because I know the ins and outs of a pen design. I know, for instance, okay, we're going to build a fountain pen. I know how much space you need to leave in the cap for the nib so that you're not going to damage the nib when you screw the cap on. I know how much space is needed in the barrel for the cartridge converter so that you've got enough room for that ink reservoir. So there's things like that it's very easy for me to figure out a pen design, just because I've done so many pen designs now and I've been doing it for so long that I can quickly do that. With watches, there's so many things that I just don't know because I just haven't worked on a lot of watches. Simple things like attaching the movement to the case. Building in the case of what I'm doing, my watch case is larger in diameter than the movement itself. So I have to build a filler for that for the movement so that it isn't just rattling around in there. So there's things like that. How do I approach that? Are there better, there's going to be a better way to approach it than what I'm thinking of originally. So it's a question of experimenting with that a little bit, figuring out what works well, what doesn't work well, and also what I can make that looks reasonable too. Just because I can design something doesn't mean that it's going to be reasonable to make. It may be just too challenging to make the way that I've thought of something. So there are a lot of challenges like that ahead, and I'm some of them I know, some of them I don't know, and I obviously haven't run into yet. So it'll be an interesting design process and design challenge, because it's something that I have a good idea of what the outside of my watch should look like. At least the case design, I'm still bouncing back and forth between a number of dial designs, everything from something that's very, very, very basic to more ornate designs. Obviously, I'm an engine turner, so my brain thinks about applying guilloche patterns to a watch dial. But just because you can do a thing doesn't mean you should do a thing. And making one of the primary purposes of a watch is that it needs to be legible. It needs to be something that you can tell the time with. Some of these particularly ornate design ideas for engine turning do not make a watch dial more legible. And so it's an interesting balance of having something that that looks good and shows off my artistic design intent and is also a usable, a functional watch.
So you're thinking more than likely you'll be making your dials out of silver?
I haven't decided on the materials I want to use in the long term. I know for the short term, my prototypes are going to be made out of silver. It's a material that I'm very comfortable with. I'm comfortable machining it. I'm comfortable engraving it. I have a lot of it around the shop just because I use it for everything. So it's something that I will start with silver just because it's a relatively inexpensive material that's very nice to work with. I think long term though, I'd like to use palladium 500 for things like cases. It's a beautiful white metal. It doesn't tarnish. It's significantly less expensive than platinum or white gold, but still you get the look of that. But it's also harder than silver. So there are a lot of advantages to something like palladium 500. What I use for dials, I'm not 100% sure what I'm going to go with for dials. Palladium 500 is obviously an option for the dials. Again, it's a white metal that I can do a lot with. Traditionally, a lot of people use silver, fine silver. But again, fine silver, it will eventually tarnish. So I don't know that I'm interested in necessarily going down that road. If I'm putting that much time and effort into making a dial, I don't know that I want it to tarnish on me.
And do you happen to know offhand whether the bleaching process that, say, old Breguets and Daniel's pieces are put through tarnishes in the same way that silver would normally?
It doesn't tarnish in the same way. It does still tarnish, though. And so silver tarnish, when you're looking at fine silver, it tends to be a light gray color. And so the bleaching process, when the bleaching process that John's talking about, you take the dial. So if you look at something like a dial that Roger Smith is doing today, for instance, he will make the dial, he will engrave it, he'll engine turn it, do all of the work that he needs to do on it, and then he will heat it and quench it in a pickle solution, a light acid solution, effectively. And that bleaching process will turn it from a highly polished piece of metal to having it gives it a matte finish, I guess, is the best way of putting it. Is there's sort of a matte finish on the metal afterwards, and it becomes a very white color, but it doesn't reflect light the same way that a highly polished engraved piece will. So with engine turning, when you see engine turning right after it's been done, you get a lot of reflection out of those cuts, and it looks, it catches the light, it catches the eye. After you bleach it, it becomes a matte finish, and it doesn't catch the eye in quite the same way. And I'm not entirely a fan of bleached dials. I know why people are doing it, and I know that it's a sort of a traditional finish, but I'm less a fan of that. I would rather see parts of a dial, like let's say you've got a flat plane. I would rather see, let's say it's around the numbers for the hours. I would rather see something like that bead blasted and put a fine texture on it. And then the parts that are engine turned, I'd rather see those left as a bright polish. But that's a personal preference. It's an aesthetic choice. And again, I can understand why Breguet and Roger Smith are doing that. It's it's a very classic look, and it's a very classic design choice.
Yeah, the bead blast with engine turning is an aesthetic I would say I haven't seen before.
The reality is that I'm not a George Daniels. I'm not a Kerry Voutilainen. I am not going to, or a Philippe Dufour. I am not going to be somebody who is going to make a significant technical watch. I'm not going to be designing watch trains that are technically very challenging and impressive. And that's fine. There are guys out there who are doing that kind of thing, and they're impressive. But that is not, realistically, that is not the kind of work that I'm going to be doing. That doesn't mean that I can't do interesting and different things with the aesthetic choices that I choose. Whether it's changing up the way that a dial is done, using engine turning in ways that people aren't using engine turning. We've mentioned before with Vacheron Constantin, the métier d'art watch styles that they're doing. Some of them, they're doing innovative things with enamel work. Some of the engine turning work they're doing on those is absolutely fabulous. And I love seeing people doing, using engine turning in a very different way, create different textures with it. And that's more what I'm interested in doing in terms of innovation. I would rather use the techniques and the design ideas that I have that I've used in pen making and that I've used in jewelry making, bring those into watches and use different techniques than what the watch world is used to using, and try and stand out in that sense. Because, again, from a technical point of view, I am not going to be, I'm not going to make the next escapement technology like a George Daniels, right? I'm not going to design something like that. It's unlikely that I'm ever going to be able to design a Grand Saunier, and build that. So, I need to have my watches stand out in some other way. So I'm going to try combinations of things that are a bit different than what people are used to using, but still look, like a classic watch. I don't want it to be too out there in terms of what the watch looks like either.
And Palladium 500 will certainly be another way that you'll be able to have a more distinct impact or look that's not entirely congruent with what's come before it, but is similar enough that you've got that shared heritage.
Right. The white metals are very, very popular for watchmaking, especially right now. People love platinum watches. They love white gold, but there are challenges and limitations to those metals. One of them being the cost. They are very expensive to work in. Something like a Palladium 500, even in the jewelry world, there are not as many people using it as there probably should be, but there are some people doing some fabulous things with it. Friend of the show, Chris Plouffe, he's doing some fabulous things with Palladium 500. He's doing some not Damascus with it. He's doing Mokume Gane with it, and it looks fabulous. It looks incredible in person. It photographs very well, and it just looks great. It creates a great contrast with other metals. Using it with silver, for instance, in Mokume Gane, it just looks fabulous. He's doing some interesting things. He's inlaying gold, 24 karat gold into Palladium 500. There are certainly some innovative things that you can do with that metal that people are not used to. And so if I can bring some of that into the watch world, again, that allows me to distinguish what I'm doing from the other boutique brands that are out there.
So you may end up needing to change the name of your company from Silver Hand to Palladium Hand.
Well, it's still a silver colored metal, right? It's I don't think I'll ever leave the silver world entirely. There's certainly advantages to it from a cost point of view. Again, making pens when you're dealing with 100 grams of silver in a pen. If I were doing something like that out of platinum, for instance, you'd be looking at closer to 200 grams of platinum. With the cost of platinum these days, that becomes an expensive pen very quickly. So, yeah, I'll always continue to use silver, especially argentium. It's a great metal to work in. It's very forgiving in a lot of ways, and it's easy to cast, and it doesn't tarnish very quickly. So there are a lot of advantages to it. But it's funny because they're happy with stainless steel. And they'll pay a premium for stainless steel, but something like a silver, I don't see a lot of watch cases being made out of silver anymore. So I think that moving to things like rose golds and Palladium 500 and that kind of metal is going to be important in my watch designs.
All right, we'll have to come back to this once the movements actually arrive.
Thanks for listening to Off Hours. You can find detailed show notes at offhours.show. If you'd like to keep up to date with the show, follow us on Twitter @offhours. John can be found on Twitter @UnderTheLoop, and Chris can be found on Twitter and Instagram @silver_hand.